The smell hit Sheriff Tom Harlan before he saw the body. Copper pennies mixed with sour mash, sweet and metallic in the October air. Behind him, his deputy retched into the laurel bushes, while Harlan stared at what remained of Ezekiel Cobb, spread across his own copper, still like a sacrifice to some hungry god. Blood had pooled in the mash tun, turning the moonshine crimson. But that wasn't the strangest part. The fire under the still burned cold blue, though no one had lit it in 3 days. The temperature gauge read 200 degrees, yet frost clung to the metal coils, and in the dirt around the still, footprints circled in perfect spirals, dozens of them, pressed deep as if made by something far heavier than human feet. The prints led nowhere, stopped at nothing, simply ended mid-step as though their maker had dissolved into mountain mist. This was Laurel County, Kentucky, 1926, where federal agents hunted moonshiners and moonshiners hunted each other. But something else was hunting too. The Appalachian Mountains kept their secrets well, buried beneath centuries of coal dust and morning fog, wrapped in ridges that rose like crooked fingers against a sky that never seemed quite blue enough. In Laurel County, Kentucky, the year 1926 brought federal prohibition agents with badges and guns. But the mountains had been brewing corn whiskey since before Kentucky was even a state. Ezekiel Cobb's still sat hidden in a fold of Raccoon Hollow, 3 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a deer path that wound through stands of oak and poplar thick enough to hide an army. The spot had been chosen carefully, water from a limestone spring that ran clear and cold year-round, timber for fuel, and most importantly, a natural bowl in the earth that would contain both sound and smoke. Ezekiel had operated here for 15 years without trouble. He paid his taxes to the local sheriff, kept his mouth shut about other operations, and produced corn liquor smooth enough to make Baptist preachers reconsider their positions on temperance. His customers included doctors in Pineville, merchants in Cumberland, and more than a few federal agents who found his product superior to anything they could confiscate from lesser distillers. The morning of October 15th, Ezekiel's nephew Billy found him. Billy Cobb was 17, mountain tall and hollow thin like most boys in Laurel County, raised on cornbread and hard work, and the understanding that some conversations never happened and some sights were never seen. He'd come to help his uncle move a shipment to Cumberland, arriving at the still just as the sun crested Pound Gap. The smell stopped him 50 yards away. Death had its own perfume in these mountains, sometimes sweet like overripe apples, sometimes sharp like metal left in rain. But this was different. This was death mixed with something else, something that made Billy's teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. He found Ezekiel draped across the copper, still like a broken doll, arms spread wide, face turned skyward. Blood had dried in rust-colored streams down the metal, pooling in the collection trough where corn liquor should have been. The fire beneath the still burned with flames the color of winter sky, cold and bright and wrong. Billy ran then, crashing through laurel and dogwood, his boots slipping on wet leaves, his breath coming in sharp bursts that turned to vapor in air, suddenly cold enough to freeze spit. He ran until his legs gave out, then crawled, then ran again, following the deer path that led back to the world of the living. He found Sheriff Harlan at Maggie's Diner in Pineville, drinking coffee black as coal and reading a 3-day-old newspaper from Louisville. Billy stood in the doorway, shaking like a wet dog, trying to find words for what he'd seen. Someone killed Uncle Ezekiel, he finally managed. Killed him at the still. That should have been the end of it, a simple murder in a place where murder was often the preferred method of settling business disputes. Harlan had investigated dozens of moonshiner killings over his 12 years as sheriff. Usually they involved money, territory, or women, sometimes all three. But as Harlan drove his Model T up the mountain road toward Raccoon Hollow, something felt different. The air was too still for October, the sky too gray, and the crows that usually filled the trees along the road were nowhere to be seen. Sheriff Tom Harlan had seen death in its various mountain costumes. Knife work that opened throats like second mouths, shotgun blasts that painted barn walls with human geometry, and beatings that left men unrecognizable even to their wives. But Ezekiel Cobb's death belonged to a different category entirely. The fire under the still burned without heat, blue flames dancing across wet wood that should have refused to ignite. Harlan held his hand 6 inches from the blaze and felt nothing but cold air. Yet the copper coils above glowed cherry red, and the mash inside the tun bubbled as if at a rolling boil. Deputy Frank Morse stood 20 feet away, his face the color of old paper. He'd grown up in these mountains, knew their moods and tempers, but this violated every law of nature he understood. "Tom," Frank called, his voice thin as mountain air. "Look at this." The footprints formed concentric circles around the still, each ring perfectly spaced, as if measured by some invisible compass. The prints themselves defied easy explanation, larger than any man's boot, deeper than weight alone could account for, and pressed into ground that felt solid as stone when Harlan tested it with his own foot. But it was the smell that bothered him most. Underneath the copper and corn mash, underneath even the metallic tang of blood, something else lingered. Something like sulfur mixed with wet earth, like the odor that rose from deep wells just before they went dry. Ezekiel lay across the still, with his arms spread wide, his face peaceful as a sleeping child's. No defensive wounds marked his hands. No signs of struggle disturbed the earth beyond those impossible circles of prints. Death had come to him gently, or at least without resistance. "How you figure someone got him up there?" Frank asked, nodding toward the body. "Ezekiel was a big man. Take 2 people to lift him." Harlan studied the still's construction. 8 feet high from base to condensing coil, copper polished to a mirror shine. The sides were too steep to climb, the top too narrow to support a man's weight. Yet somehow Ezekiel had ended up draped across it like a sacrifice. Maybe he climbed up himself, Harlan suggested, though the words felt foolish even as he spoke them. Why would he do that? October 22nd, 1926. Coroner's preliminary note. No obvious cause of death. Body positioned post-mortem. Recommend full autopsy pending federal clearance. The federal angle complicated everything. Technically, any crime involving illegal alcohol fell under federal jurisdiction, which meant Agent Dale Hatcher would arrive from Lexington within the day. Hatcher was a thin, pale man who wore his badge like a shield against mountain justice, and his presence would turn a local investigation into something larger and more dangerous. But Harlan had grown up in these hills, and he knew they kept their own counsel. Federal agents could ask questions and take photographs and file reports, but they couldn't read the language written in morning frost or interpret the messages carried by evening wind. That language was telling him something was very wrong in Raccoon Hollow. As Harlan and Frank prepared to move the body, the blue fire beneath the still suddenly flared, rising 3 feet into the air before settling back to its original height. The flare lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but in that brief moment, Harlan would have sworn he saw something moving within the flames, a shape that might have been human, writhing like a man in agony. "Did you see that?" Frank whispered. Harlan nodded, though he couldn't have described what he'd seen if his life depended on it. They wrapped Ezekiel in a canvas tarp and loaded him into the back of Harlan's truck. The body felt lighter than it should have, as if death had taken more than just life from the old moonshiner. As they drove down the mountain, Harlan glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the blue fire still burning in the distance, a cold star against the gray October sky. Agent Dale Hatcher arrived in Pineville on the afternoon train, carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of confidence that comes from never having lived anywhere you could walk to the county line in under an hour. He stood 6 feet tall in polished shoes, his suit pressed sharp enough to cut paper, his pale eyes taking inventory of everything they touched. Harlan met him at the depot, recognizing the type immediately. Another city boy sent, south to civilize the mountains, convinced that federal law could succeed where geography and tradition had failed for 2 centuries. "Sheriff," Hatcher said, extending a hand that felt soft as a child's, "I understand you have a situation that requires federal attention." They drove to the courthouse in silence, Hatcher taking notes in a small leather journal, documenting everything from the number of churches they passed to the condition of the roads. At the courthouse, Harlan spread out his case file, photographs of the scene, the coroner's preliminary report, statements from Billy and the other family members he'd managed to interview. Hatcher studied the photographs with the detached interest of someone examining insects under glass. "Ritualistic," he murmured. "The positioning suggests symbolic meaning. Have you considered connections to occult practices?" "Can't say I have. These mountain communities often retain pre-Christian beliefs, superstitions that manifest in violence when combined with illegal activities." Hatcher set down a photograph of the footprints. These could be ceremonial markings, perhaps related to territorial disputes between competing distilling operations. Harlan said nothing. He'd lived in these mountains for 43 years, and while he'd encountered his share of strange beliefs and stranger practitioners, he'd never seen anything like what waited in Raccoon Hollow. "I'll need to examine the scene personally," Hatcher continued, "and I'll want to interview the victims' associates. In my experience, moonshining operations involve extensive criminal networks that often resort to intimidation tactics designed to appear supernatural." They drove up to Raccoon Hollow just as evening shadows began pooling in the deeper parts of the forest. The blue fire still burned beneath the still, though it seemed dimmer now, as if whatever fed it was slowly starving. Hatcher approached the still with scientific precision, taking measurements and photographs, collecting samples of the ash beneath the cold flames. He showed no reaction to the temperature differential, no acknowledgement of the wrongness that hung over the place like invisible fog. "Interesting," he said, testing the fire with a metal rod. "Chemical reaction of some kind, possibly acetylene mixed with copper compounds. Creates the blue coloration and reduces combustion temperature." "What about the footprints?" "Staging. Someone wanted this to look otherworldly." Hatcher circled the prints with professional interest. "Probably made with weighted boots or some kind of mechanical device. The goal is to frighten locals away from federal investigation." As if summoned by his skepticism, the fire suddenly roared upward, blue flames reaching 8 feet into the air. The temperature around the still dropped 20 degrees in seconds, turning their breath to vapor. Frost formed on the copper coils with audible cracking sounds. Hatcher stumbled backward, his composure finally cracking. "What in the hell?" The fire settled back to its original height, leaving only the echo of impossible heat and the smell of sulfur strong enough to make both men's eyes water. Chemical reaction, Harlan said quietly. Right. They returned to town as full darkness claimed the mountains. Behind them, the blue fire burned on through the night, visible from 3 ridges away like a cold star that had fallen to earth and decided to stay. The next morning brought news that would reshape everything they thought they understood about Ezekiel Cobb's death. Martha Hensley lived closest to Raccoon Hollow, her cabin perched on a ridge that overlooked the valley where Ezekiel ran his still. She'd been brewing her own corn liquor for 30 years, serving a clientele that included half the deacons at Liberty Baptist Church and both doctors in Cumberland. When Sheriff Harlan knocked on her door the morning after his visit to the hollow with Agent Hatcher, no one answered. The cabin sat empty, windows dark, no smoke rising from the chimney despite the October cold. Martha's Model A Ford remained parked beside the house, keys still hanging from the ignition. Inside, coffee sat cold in chipped cups, breakfast half-eaten on the table. Cornbread crumbled on plates beside eggs that had grown a skin of grease. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to ashes, though neighbors insisted they'd seen smoke from Martha's chimney just the day before. Looks like they left in a hurry, Deputy Morse observed, studying the scene. But where'd they go without the car? Harlan found Martha's still behind the cabin, tucked into a fold of rock that kept it hidden from both federal agents and competing moonshiners. The copper kettle sat cold and empty, but the ground around it told a story that made his stomach clench. More footprints. The same impossible size, the same perfect circles, the same depths that defied explanation. They led from Martha's still up the ridge toward Raccoon Hollow, a trail of pressed earth that disappeared where solid rock began. Tom. Frank's voice carried a note of strain that made Harlan look up sharply. We got company. 3 more families lived within walking distance of Ezekiel's operation. The Napiers, the Bowlings, and old Silas Creek, who'd been distilling whiskey since before the Civil War. Each cabin sat empty, breakfast abandoned, fires cold. Each still showed the same circular patterns of impossible footprints leading toward Raccoon Hollow. 15 people vanished overnight without taking their vehicles, without packing belongings, without leaving word for relatives or business partners. They simply walked away from their lives and disappeared into the mountains as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Agent Hatcher arrived at Martha's cabin while Harlan was still documenting the scene. The federal agent's confidence had dimmed since his encounter with the cold fire, but he maintained his official skepticism like armor against doubt. Mass exodus, Hatcher announced, studying the abandoned breakfast. Criminal conspiracy members fleeing federal investigation. This supports my theory about organized illegal activity in the region. 15 people just walked away from everything they owned. Fear motivates irrational behavior. Word spreads quickly in isolated communities. They're probably hiding in relatives' homes in neighboring counties. But Harlan knew better. Mountain families might hide federal agents or lie to outsiders, but they didn't abandon their homes and livelihoods without cause. These people had lived through economic collapse, coal mine disasters, and blood feuds that lasted generations. Running wasn't in their nature. That evening, Harlan sat in his kitchen with a glass of Martha Hensley's corn liquor, evidence he'd officially confiscated but personally appreciated, and studied a hand-drawn map of Raccoon Hollow and the surrounding ridges. The abandoned homes formed a rough circle around Ezekiel's still, each one precisely positioned as if following some invisible geometry. His wife Sarah found him there after midnight. The map spread across the table, his glass empty, his expression troubled in ways she hadn't seen since his return from France 8 years earlier. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Harlan had shared 30 years and 3 children with Sarah, had weathered everything from influenza epidemics to mine cave-ins. But some knowledge felt too dangerous to voice. Instead, he pointed to the map, to the pattern of abandoned homes. "They all knew something was coming," he said finally. "Question is how they knew, and why they didn't warn anyone else." Reverend Isaiah Combs had ministered to the souls of Laurel County for 22 years, long enough to understand the difference between mountain justice and divine judgment. His congregation at Liberty Baptist included both federal agents and moonshiners, sometimes sitting in the same pew, united in their need for salvation, if not in their views on temperance. The Sunday after the disappearances, Combs climbed into his pulpit with a sermon that departed dramatically from his planned remarks on Christian charity. "There's an evil loose in these mountains," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "Not the kind that wears badges or carries guns. Not the kind that can be bargained with or reasoned away. The kind that demands payment in blood and takes what it's owed, regardless of law or justice." Sheriff Harlan sat in the third pew, his wife beside him, their 3 children fidgeting in starched Sunday clothes. Around them, faces he'd known all his life wore expressions of fear, barely held in check. "Some of you know what I'm talking about," Combs continued. "Some of you have seen things in Raccoon Hollow that don't belong to this world. Some of you have heard voices calling from places where no living soul should be." A woman in the back pew began weeping softly. 2 men near the front shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the children seemed to sense something beyond their understanding. "The Lord's vengeance is righteous," Combs said, his voice rising. "But this isn't the Lord's work. This is something else. Something that feeds on violence and grows stronger with each soul it claims. And if we don't find a way to stop it, we're all going to pay the price." After service, Harlan lingered as the congregation filed out, noting who avoided eye contact and who seemed eager to leave. When only a handful of people remained, Combs approached him with the careful steps of a man walking on ice. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you privately." They walked to the small office behind the altar, a cramped space filled with hymnals and church records dating back to 1868. Combs poured coffee from a pot that had been warming since dawn, his hands steady despite the morning's dramatic sermon. "What do you know about Ezekiel's death that you're not saying?" Harlan asked. Combs was quiet for a long moment, studying his coffee as if it might contain answers. Finally, he opened a desk drawer and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. "My predecessor kept detailed records," he said, opening the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Births, deaths, marriages, but also other things. Things the official church records don't mention." The page was dated September 12, 1897, written in a careful hand that spoke of formal education. The entry described the death of a moonshiner named Thomas Bowling, found at his still with no mark of violence upon him, yet bearing the appearance of one who died in terrible fear. "Look at the next entry," Combs said. September 15, 1897. 3 families departed the hollow without word or warning. Their homes stand empty, meals abandoned, fires cold. The neighbors speak of strange lights in the mountains and voices calling from the darkness. "Same pattern," Harlan murmured. Combs turned more pages, revealing similar entries scattered across 30 years. Moonshiners found dead at their stills. Families vanishing without trace. Blue lights seen burning in places where no fire should exist. Every 29 years, Combs said quietly. Like clockwork. Something wakes up in Raccoon Hollow, claims what it's owed, then goes back to sleep. Harlan did the math. 1897 plus 29 years equaled 1926. What wakes it up? Murder. Always starts with murder. Someone kills a moonshiner in the hollow, spills blood on ground that remembers every drop it's ever tasted. Combs closed the journal. According to these records, it'll claim 7 souls before it rests again. Ezekiel was the first. The missing families make 6 more. That's only 7 total. No, Combs said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ezekiel wasn't the first this time. He was number 7. The Laurel County Historical Society occupied 3 rooms above the post office, filled with dusty ledgers and faded photographs that documented 2 centuries of mountain life. Mrs. Eleanor Rash had served as its volunteer curator for 15 years, filing away birth certificates and death notices, marriage records and property deeds, preserving the official history of a community that had always preferred to keep its business private. She met Sheriff Harlan at the society's door on Monday morning, her gray hair pulled back severely, her expression suggesting she'd been expecting his visit. "You're here about the hollow," she said, without preamble. "Among other things." She led him up narrow stairs to a room lined with filing cabinets and banker's boxes, each labeled with dates and categories. The air smelled of old paper and mothballs, history preserved in cardboard and manila folders. "Federal records only go back to statehood," Mrs. Rash said, pulling a thick folder from a cabinet marked Land Grants, 1792-1820. "But families keep their own accounts. Diaries, letters, business records, things they don't want the government knowing about." She spread documents across a worn table, hand-drawn maps, property surveys, personal correspondence written in fading ink. The papers painted a picture of Raccoon Hollow that differed dramatically from official accounts. "Cherokee called it the hungry place," Mrs. Rash said, pointing to a map drawn by an early surveyor. "Wouldn't hunt there, wouldn't camp there. Said something lived in the rocks that fed on human sorrow." The Cherokee had been driven from Kentucky before statehood, but their warnings had been recorded by white settlers who ignored them at their peril. A letter dated June 3, 1804, described the death of 3 hunters found at their camp, bearing no wounds, yet twisted in death as if they had seen the very gates of hell. First moonshiner to set up in the hollow was a man named Jacob Turner, Mrs. Rash continued, producing a photograph of a bearded man standing beside a primitive still. Spring of 1836, found dead that October, his still cold, his body laid out like a sacrifice. She opened another folder, this one containing newspaper clippings from the Cumberland Herald, dating back to the Civil War. The headlines told a consistent story. Mysterious deaths in Raccoon Hollow, families abandoning their homes without explanation, blue lights seen burning in the mountains. "Always the same pattern," Mrs. Rash said. "Someone spills blood in the hollow, wakes something up, and it feeds until it's satisfied." 7 souls, Harlan said, remembering Reverend Combs's words. 7 souls every 29 years. Like paying rent on land that never really belonged to anyone living. November 1st, 1868, Private Diary, Margaret Bowling. "The thing in the hollow took my husband and son. I seen them walking, toward the blue fire, their eyes empty as winter sky. They ain't coming back." The entries painted a picture of a community living with generational terror. Families who knew their neighbors might vanish any October. Children raised to avoid certain paths and never investigate strange lights. It was knowledge passed down like family recipes, essential information that kept people alive. "Why didn't anyone warn Ezekiel?" Harlan asked. Mrs. Rash's expression grew complicated. "Some things can't be warned against. Some debts have to be paid whether we want them to or not." She showed him one final document, a contract written in 18th century script, signed by 5 families who'd settled in the area before Kentucky became a state. The language was formal and archaic, but the meaning was clear. In exchange for permission to live and work in Raccoon Hollow, the families agreed to provide 7 souls every 29 years as payment to the guardian of the deep places. "Protection money," Harlan said. "Survival tax. Those 5 families, the Cobbs, Hensleys, Napiers, Bowlings, and Creeks, they've been paying it ever since. Usually volunteers from families that had grown old or sick. Sometimes criminals or outsiders who wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. But not this year. Not this year." Mrs. Rash refolded the contract with careful hands. This year, someone decided to break the arrangement. Started killing moonshiners instead of feeding them to the hollow proper-like. She looked at Harlan with eyes that held 30 years of keeping dangerous secrets. "Question is, who broke the contract, and what are they planning to do when that thing comes for them instead?" The answer came at dawn on Tuesday, delivered by Billy Cobb's 10-year-old nephew Danny, who'd run 3 miles from his family's cabin with news that couldn't wait for proper channels. "Uncle Billy's gone crazy," the boy gasped, collapsing in Harlan's kitchen while Sarah pressed a glass of water into his shaking hands. "He's got a rifle, and he's talking about settling scores." Billy Cobb had been Ezekiel's favorite nephew, the one chosen to learn the family trade and inherit the operation in Raccoon Hollow. Finding his uncle's body had broken something fundamental in the young man's mind, replaced grief with a fury that burned cold and bright as the fire beneath Ezekiel's still. According to Danny, Billy had spent the night cleaning his rifle and declaring his intention to find his uncle's killer. More troubling, he'd spoken of dreams where Ezekiel appeared to him, pointing toward the mountain ridges and whispering names. "He says Uncle Ezekiel told him who done it," Danny continued between gulps of water. "Says the dead don't lie like the living do." Harlan found Billy at the Cobb family cemetery, a small plot carved from the mountainside where 4 generations lay beneath carved sandstone markers. Billy knelt beside a fresh grave, his rifle across his knees, his clothes still stained with mud from digging. "Morning, Sheriff," Billy said without looking up. "Come to arrest me?" "Depends on what you're planning to do with that rifle." Billy was 27 years old, mountain lean and hard-muscled from years of physical labor. He'd served 2 years in France during the war, came home with a silver star and knowledge of violence that went beyond what the mountains had taught him. "You know what happened to Uncle Ezekiel?" Billy said, finally meeting Harlan's eyes. "You know it wasn't natural, wasn't normal. Something killed him that shouldn't exist in God's green earth." Harlan sat on a nearby headstone, keeping his hands visible, his voice calm. "What did your uncle tell you?" "Names. Names of the families that made the old contract. Names of the ones who decided to break it this year." Billy's grip tightened on the rifle. "They fed him to that thing, Sheriff. Fed him to it like a sacrifice. Even if that's true, what are you going to do about it?" Billy stood slowly, shouldering the rifle with practiced ease. "Uncle Ezekiel says the thing in the hollow won't rest until it gets its 7. Says it's hungry and getting hungrier, and if it can't have the ones it was promised, it'll take whoever it can find." He started walking down the mountain, his boots crunching through fallen leaves. Says I got to give it what it wants before it decides to take my family instead. Harlan followed, staying 20 feet behind, close enough to talk but far enough to react if Billy's grief turned violent. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice. Mountain justice. The kind federal agents don't understand and courts can't provide. Billy paused at the edge of the cemetery. You can try to stop me, Sheriff, but you know I'm right. You know something's wrong in these mountains, and you know the law can't fix it. What would you do if you watched your neighbors vanish one by one, knowing their fate was sealed by contracts signed before your grandparents were born? What would you do if the choice came down to murder or waiting for something inhuman to claim everyone you loved? Billy disappeared into the forest, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned to hunt both animals and men. Behind him, the morning mist rose from the valleys like souls escaping earth, and somewhere in the distance, crows began calling warnings that no living thing could understand. Harlan stood alone in the cemetery, surrounded by graves that marked 2 centuries of mountain deaths, and realized he was about to witness something that would make all previous violence seem simple and clean. By noon, Billy Cobb had killed 2 men. The first was Silas Creek Jr., found in his cornfield with his throat opened by a knife thrust delivered with surgical precision. The second was Nathan Napier, discovered in his barn, a bullet through his heart fired from close range. Both men were members of families named in the old contract. Both had been among those who decided to break the arrangement, with whatever waited in Raccoon Hollow. Sheriff Harlan arrived at the Napier farm to find Agent Hatcher already there, crouched beside Nathan's body with his leather notebook, sketching angles and documenting evidence. The federal agent's confidence had returned now that he faced normal human violence, instead of blue fires and impossible footprints. 2 murders in 3 hours, Hatcher said without looking up. Professional work, military training evident in both kills. I've telegraphed Louisville for additional agents. Won't do any good, Harlan replied, studying the barn's interior. Billy knows these mountains better than any federal agent ever will. He can stay hidden for months if he wants to. Then we make it clear that hiding won't protect him. Hatcher closed his notebook with a sharp snap. I'm declaring martial law in this county. No one travels these roads without federal escort. No one enters or leaves Raccoon Hollow without permission. Harlan almost laughed. Martial law in Laurel County would be like declaring war on fog, possible to announce but impossible to enforce. The mountains contained 1,000 hiding places, caves and hollows and ridges where a man could disappear for decades if he knew the country. But Hatcher's plan had consequences beyond its futility. Word of federal martial law would spread through the mountains faster than wildfire, turning a local problem into something larger and more dangerous. Mountain families who'd never cared about moonshining or murders would start viewing federal agents as invaders, and that never ended well for anyone wearing a badge. The afternoon brought news of Billy's 3rd kill. Marcus Bowling, shot dead beside his own still, his body positioned with the same careful arrangement that had marked Ezekiel's death. But this time, something had been left beside the corpse, a note written in Billy's careful handwriting. 3 down, 4 to go. The hungry place will have what it's owed. Agent Hatcher read the note with growing excitement, convinced he'd identified a simple pattern of revenge killings. But Harlan recognized something more complex at work, a young man trying to satisfy an ancient debt before it could claim innocent lives, using violence to prevent greater violence. That evening, families throughout Laurel County began packing their belongings, loading children and valuables into wagons and automobiles. They drove not toward town, but deeper into the mountains, following roads that didn't appear on any federal map, seeking relatives in counties where ancient contracts held no power. The exodus was quiet and efficient, conducted without discussion or announcement. Mountain families simply recognized when a place had become too dangerous for living, and they responded with the practiced calm of people who'd survived 2 centuries of violence. By midnight, half the population of Raccoon Hollow had vanished, leaving behind empty cabins and cold stoves, abandoned lives that testified to fear stronger than attachment to home. Sheriff Harlan stood in his own kitchen, watching Sarah pack their belongings with quick, efficient movements. She'd grown up in these mountains, understood their moods and dangers better than any outsider could learn. "We should leave too," she said without looking at him. "Take the children and go to my sister's place in Virginia." "Can't do that, I'm the sheriff." "You're a husband and father first." She paused in her packing, meeting his eyes. "Tom, there's something moving in these mountains that's bigger than your badge, bigger than federal law, something that's going to keep killing until it gets what it wants." Through the kitchen window, Harlan could see lights moving on the distant ridges. Not electric lights or lantern flames, but something blue and cold that hurt to look at directly. The lights danced and flickered like signals being passed between invisible watchers. Tomorrow, Billy Cobb would claim his 4th victim, and the thing in Raccoon Hollow would grow stronger with each soul offered to its hunger. Agent Hatcher's reinforcements arrived on Wednesday morning, 6 men in dark suits carrying Thompson submachine guns, led by Assistant Director James Morrison from the Federal Bureau's Louisville office. They established headquarters in the Laurel County Courthouse, transforming Sheriff Harlan's modest office into a command center bristling with maps, radio equipment, and enough firepower to fight a small war. Morrison was a compact man with gray hair and the kind of authority that came from 15 years of chasing bank robbers and bootleggers across 3 states. He treated the situation in Raccoon Hollow like any other federal operation: clear objectives, overwhelming force, swift resolution. 4 men dead in 3 days, Morrison announced during his first briefing. The perpetrator is William Cobb, age 27, military veteran with known associates in the illegal alcohol trade. We're dealing with a simple vendetta disguised as something more mysterious. The federal agents spread across Laurel County with military precision, establishing roadblocks and checkpoints, searching vehicles and questioning anyone who couldn't provide satisfactory explanation for their presence. It was exactly the kind of heavy-handed response that mountain communities had resented since Kentucky joined the Union. By noon, 3 agents had been shot at from concealed positions. By evening, their command post's radio antenna had been cut, their vehicles' tires slashed, and someone had painted "Feds Go Home" across the courthouse's front steps in what looked suspiciously like blood. "Local resistance," Morrison explained to Sheriff Harlan during their tense meeting that afternoon. "Standard pattern when federal authority challenges entrenched criminal networks. We'll maintain pressure until they cooperate." Harlan didn't bother explaining that the resistance had nothing to do with criminal networks and everything to do with outsiders trying to impose their will on people who'd been governing themselves since before the federal government existed. Instead, he focused on more immediate concerns. "Billy Cobb killed his 4th man this morning," Harlan reported. "Samuel Hensley found dead beside Possum Creek with a knife in his back." Morrison studied a map of the county, red pins marking the murder sites. "Pattern suggests he's working his way through predetermined targets. If we can identify his remaining objectives, we can set a trap." His remaining objectives are the families that signed the old contract. "What contract?" Harlan explained about the documents he'd discovered at the Historical Society, the agreements that bound 5 families to provide 7 souls every 29 years. Morrison listened with the patient expression of someone humoring a local's superstitions. "Fascinating folklore," Morrison said when Harlan finished. "But we're dealing with a disturbed veteran using historical grievances to justify murder. The supernatural elements are window dressing designed to confuse and intimidate." That night, the blue fires in Raccoon Hollow burned brighter than ever before, visible from 6 counties away. Pilots flying mail routes between Lexington and Knoxville reported strange lights in the Cumberland Mountains, while radio operators across eastern Kentucky received transmissions that sounded like human voices speaking in languages no one could identify. The temperature in the hollow dropped to 15 degrees below zero, despite the fact that it was only October. Ice formed on trees and buildings, coating everything in crystal shells that reflected the blue fire like 1,000 mirrors. Agent Morrison stood on the courthouse steps at midnight, watching the lights dance across the distant mountains, his confidence finally beginning to crack under the weight of evidence that defied rational explanation. "What exactly are we dealing with here, Sheriff?" he asked quietly. Harlan lit a cigarette, the flame momentarily warming his hands in the unseasonable cold. "Something that's been collecting debts in these mountains since before your government existed. Something that doesn't care about federal law or federal agents. And you believe this Cobb character is trying to satisfy this thing's demands?" "I believe Billy Cobb is trying to save his family the only way he knows how." Harlan took a long drag, let the smoke escape slowly into the frigid air. "Question is whether he can finish the job before that thing gets tired of waiting." Billy Cobb had been moving through the mountains for 4 days, living off cached supplies and knowledge passed down through generations of hunters and moonshiners. He knew which springs ran clean year-round, which caves stayed warm in winter, which ridges provided clear views of approaching danger. More importantly, he knew the rhythms of federal operations, how agents thought, how they moved, where they would set their ambushes. He'd learned these lessons in France, fighting an enemy that controlled the official terrain while he and his unit operated in the spaces between authority and chaos. The 5th killing happened at dawn on Thursday, precise and efficient as the others. Jesse Creek, the last adult male from his family line, found shot through the head while checking his rabbit traps. Billy left no note this time, but he positioned the body carefully, arms spread wide, face turned toward the sky, mimicking the arrangement he'd discovered at his uncle's still. Sheriff Harlan arrived at the scene before the federal agents, following back roads and deer paths that didn't appear on their maps. The forest around Jesse's body felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with murder. Too quiet, too cold, charged with the kind of electricity that preceded thunderstorms. Jesse Creek had been 63 years old, a quiet man who'd spent his life tending crops and avoiding attention. He'd never married, never had children, lived alone in a cabin that his grandfather had built before the Civil War. His death left no direct family members, making him a perfect candidate for the Hollow's ancient hunger. But it also meant Billy Cobb had only 2 targets remaining: Martha Hensley's missing daughter Rebecca and William Napier's son Thomas. Both had fled with their families when the disappearances began, vanishing into the mountains or neighboring counties. Agent Hatcher found Harlan beside Jesse's body, his face pale from the October cold that shouldn't have existed. The federal agent had lost weight during his week in Laurel County, his city pallor replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd seen too much of what he couldn't understand. 5 murders in 4 days, Hatcher said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. Morrison's calling for additional resources. Military units from Fort Knox. Military won't help. Why not? Harlan gestured toward the trees surrounding Jesse's body, where ice had formed despite the morning sun, coating branches and leaves in crystalline shells that tinkled like wind chimes when the air moved. Because you can't shoot what you're really fighting. They heard Morrison's voice before they saw him, barking orders into a radio handset as he approached through the trees. The assistant director had been awake for 36 hours, coordinating search patterns and reinforcement requests, trying to impose federal order on a situation that defied every protocol he knew. "Cobb's running out of targets," Morrison announced as he reached the crime scene. "Intelligence suggests the remaining members of his target families have fled the area. We've got him cornered." "That's what I'm afraid of," Harlan said quietly. Morrison didn't understand, but Harlan did. Billy Cobb wasn't a criminal running from justice. He was a young man trying to satisfy an ancient debt before something inhuman decided to collect its payment in other ways. If Billy couldn't find his remaining targets, if he couldn't complete the list of 7 souls, then whatever waited in Raccoon Hollow might start choosing its own victims. October 27, 1926. Federal Field Report. Local resistance continues. Personnel reporting equipment failures, radio interference, and severe weather anomalies inconsistent with regional patterns. That afternoon brought news that validated Harlan's fears. A family from Pineville, the Washingtons, who had no connection to the old contracts or moonshining operations, had vanished from their home during the previous night. Their breakfast sat cold on the table. Their car remained in the driveway, but 11 people had simply walked away from their lives without explanation. More families disappeared over the following hours. The Millers, the Johnsons, the Roebucks. All found with their homes abandoned, their possessions left behind, their footprints leading toward Raccoon Hollow in patterns that matched those found around the empty stills. By evening, 43 people had vanished from Laurel County in less than 12 hours. The thing in the hollow was no longer waiting for Billy Cobb to complete his list. It was collecting its payment directly. Sheriff Harlan found Mrs. Eleanor Rash barricaded inside the Historical Society building, surrounded by boxes of documents and artifacts that represented 2 centuries of mountain history. She'd been there for 3 days, surviving on canned goods and well water, documenting everything she knew about the contracts and their consequences. "It's accelerating," she said without preamble when Harlan climbed through the window she'd left unlatched for his visit. "The 29-year cycle is collapsing. Whatever's in that hollow isn't willing to wait for Billy Cobb to finish his work." She showed him documents she'd assembled during her self-imposed imprisonment. Letters, diaries, business records that traced the original bargain back to its source. The story began in 1794, when 5 families received land grants in what would become Laurel County. The Cherokee had warned them about Raccoon Hollow, spoken of something that lived in the deep caves beneath the mountains, something that had been sleeping since before their grandfathers' grandfathers were born. But the white settlers ignored the warnings, drawn by limestone springs and fertile soil, convinced that European civilization could overcome any indigenous superstition. The first deaths came within months. Hunting parties found with their throats opened by claws too large for any known animal. Children who wandered into the hollow returned speaking of blue fires and voices that called from beneath the earth. Livestock discovered drained of blood, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Winter of 1795, Mrs. Rash said, reading from a personal diary written in fading brown ink. 47 souls taken in 3 months. The survivors were ready to abandon the area entirely. Instead, they made a bargain. The negotiation was conducted by a Cherokee medicine man named Joseph Ridge, who served as interpreter between the settlers and whatever intelligence waited in the hollow's depths. The terms were simple: 7 souls every 29 years, selected from the 5 families that had claimed the land, offered willingly as payment for permission to live and work in the territory. Payment for what? Harlan asked. For trespass. For taking land that didn't belong to humans, living or dead. Mrs. Rash closed the diary. The thing in the hollow isn't evil, Sheriff. It's a landlord collecting rent. The arrangement had worked for over a century. Every 29 years, the 5 families would select 7 members, usually elderly relatives who volunteered, sometimes criminals or outcasts who posed problems for the community. They would walk into Raccoon Hollow during the October new moon and simply disappear, taken by something that consumed more than flesh and bone. What changed this year? Mrs. Rash opened a more recent folder, containing bank documents and property deeds from the past decade. The papers told a story of economic pressure and generational change, young people leaving the mountains for cities, families selling their lands to coal companies and timber operations. Only 2 families are left, she said. The others sold their holdings and moved away, broke the generational chain that maintained the contract. This year, when the payment came due, there weren't enough volunteers. So someone decided to break the arrangement entirely. Someone decided to fight instead of pay, started killing moonshiners in the hollow, thinking violence might drive the thing away or satisfy its hunger differently. Mrs. Rash's expression grew grim. They were wrong. Outside, the temperature continued dropping despite the afternoon sun. Ice formed on windows and sidewalks, while the blue fires in Raccoon Hollow blazed higher and brighter, visible even in daylight. Radio reports described similar phenomena appearing across eastern Kentucky: unexplained lights, vanishing families, temperatures that defied weather patterns. The contract had been broken, and something that had slept for 29 years was fully awake, collecting its payment with interest. Billy Cobb had been tracking Rebecca Hensley for 2 days, following a trail that led through counties where his own family had no connections, where federal agents watched every road and local sheriffs had orders to shoot on sight. He found her at her sister's farm in Bell County, a small holding where 3 families had gathered to wait out what they hoped would be temporary danger. Rebecca was 34 years old, the last adult member of her family line, mother of 2 children who played in the barn while their elders discussed matters they couldn't understand. She'd inherited her mother's knowledge of brewing and her father's skill at avoiding federal attention, but neither talent could protect her from the debt her bloodline owed to Raccoon Hollow. Billy approached the farm at dawn, moving through early morning mist that rose from the valley floor like smoke from invisible fires. He carried his rifle and a letter he'd written the night before, explaining his actions to anyone who might find it after he finished his work. "Rebecca," he called from the tree line, his voice carrying across the farmyard. "Need to talk with you." She emerged from the farmhouse, her hands visible, her expression calm despite the circumstances. Behind her, Billy could see faces at windows, her sister's family, preparing to defend their home against whatever came next. "Billy Cobb," she said, recognizing him despite the weeks he'd spent living rough in the mountains. "Come to kill me?" "Come to give you a choice." He walked into the yard, keeping his rifle pointed at the ground, showing no immediate threat. The morning air felt wrong, too cold, too charged with electricity, filled with sounds that might have been wind but seemed to carry human voices. "Choice is this," Billy said, stopping 20 feet from the porch. "You can come with me willing. Walk into Raccoon Hollow like your ancestors intended. Let the thing there have what it's owed. Or you can make me shoot you here, and it'll take your children instead." Rebecca glanced toward the barn where her son and daughter were feeding chickens, their laughter carrying across the yard like birdsong. "What about Thomas Napier?" "Already found him. Already gave him the same choice." Billy's voice carried no satisfaction, only the weary resignation of someone fulfilling an obligation that offered no reward. He chose his family's safety over his own life. That meant 6 souls had been claimed or offered. Ezekiel Cobb, killed by whoever broke the contract. Silas Creek Jr., Nathan Napier, Marcus Bowling, Samuel Hensley, and Jesse Creek, executed by Billy's careful planning. And Thomas Napier, who'd accepted his fate to protect his children. Rebecca Hensley would complete the payment. "If I go with you, it stops?" she asked. "The thing in the hollow goes back to sleep?" "For 29 years. And if I don't?" Billy gestured toward the horizon, where blue lights had begun appearing even in daylight, dancing across ridges and valleys like signals passed between invisible armies. "It takes whoever it wants until it's satisfied. Could be dozens, could be hundreds." Rebecca kissed her children goodbye, telling them she was going to help Uncle Billy with important business. She left letters for her sister and husband, explaining her choice and asking them to remember her as someone who'd tried to protect the people she loved. She and Billy walked into the mountains together, following paths that led back toward Laurel County, and the hollow where something ancient waited to collect its payment. Behind them, her children played in the autumn sunshine, unaware that their mother was walking toward a death that would purchase their safety for 3 decades. Sheriff Harlan intercepted Billy Cobb and Rebecca Hensley at Possum Creek, the last stream before Raccoon Hollow. He'd been waiting since dawn, knowing the paths Billy would use, understanding the mathematics that drove the young man toward his final objective. Agent Morrison and 6 federal agents surrounded the creek from concealed positions, their weapons trained on Billy's trail, orders to capture or kill depending on resistance. Morrison had spent 8 days in Laurel County, watching his authority dissolve into mountain mist, and he was determined to end the situation with overwhelming force. Billy emerged from the forest like a ghost materializing from memory, Rebecca beside him, both walking with the steady pace of people who'd accepted their destination. Billy carried his rifle, but not in any threatening manner, more like a walking stick than a weapon, a tool that had served its purpose and would soon be discarded. "Billy," Harlan called from his position beside the creek. "That's far enough." Billy stopped, studying the positions of the federal agents, calculating odds and distances with military precision. He could probably kill 3 of them before they brought him down, maybe 4 if he used Rebecca as cover. But killing federal agents would only escalate the situation, turn a local problem into a national incident. "Sheriff," Billy said calmly, "come to arrest me?" "Come to talk." Billy lowered his rifle, setting it against a tree trunk, showing his empty hands. Rebecca stood beside him, her face calm as someone preparing for an execution that would save her family. "Nothing to talk about," Billy continued. "Got one more job to finish, then it's done." Morrison stepped from concealment, his Thompson submachine gun trained on Billy's chest. Behind him, 6 agents emerged from their positions, surrounding the creek, with enough firepower to level a small building. "William Cobb," Morrison announced, his voice carrying federal authority across the water. You're under arrest for 5 counts of murder. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Billy ignored the federal agent, his attention fixed on Sheriff Harlan. "You know what happens if I don't finish this. You've seen what's already started." Harlan had seen. 43 people vanished in 2 days. Their families destroyed, their lives consumed by something that grew stronger with each soul it claimed. The blue fires in Raccoon Hollow now burned visible from 50 miles away, and reports came hourly of similar phenomena appearing across eastern Kentucky. "There might be another way," Harlan said. "No other way. Contract calls for 7 souls from the 5 families. Got 6 delivered, need 1 more." Billy glanced at Rebecca, his expression holding genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Miss Rebecca. I truly am." "I understand," she replied. "I've got children to protect." Morrison stepped forward, his weapon still trained on Billy. "Both of you are under federal arrest. There will be no more killing, no more of this superstitious nonsense." That's when the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 10 seconds. Ice formed on the creek surface, crackling like breaking glass. Frost appeared on trees and rocks, coating everything in crystalline shells that reflected the federal agents' electric torches like 1,000 mirrors. The air grew so cold that breathing became painful, each exhalation turning to vapor that hung in the air like accusation. And from the direction of Raccoon Hollow came a sound that had no place in any world where federal agents carried authority, a howling that might have been wind but carried too much intelligence, too much hunger, too much patient malevolence. "What in the name of God?" Morrison began, but his words were cut off as something moved through the trees around them. Not something they could see directly, but something that disturbed the forest in ways that violated every law of nature. Trees bent away from invisible presence. Leaves fell upward instead of down. Shadows moved independently of their sources, reaching toward the humans gathered beside the creek. Billy Cobb picked up his rifle and walked toward Rebecca Hensley, his movement deliberate and final. Morrison shouted orders. Federal agents aimed their weapons, but nobody fired because they could all feel it now. Something vast and ancient and utterly without mercy focusing its attention on their small gathering beside the water. "I'm sorry," Billy said again, and shot Rebecca through the heart. She fell beside the creek, her blood seeping into water that had run clear for centuries, her death completing a payment that had been demanded since 1794. 7 souls offered to something that lived in the deep places beneath the mountains. 7 lives exchanged for permission to exist in territory that belonged to forces older than human memory. The howling stopped. The temperature rose. The ice melted, and the shadows returned to their proper places, and the forest became just a forest again, empty of anything more threatening than ordinary October silence. Billy Cobb set down his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. "It's finished," he said to Sheriff Harlan. "Contract satisfied for another 29 years. The trial of William Billy Cobb became a federal showcase, held in Louisville during the spring of 1927, with newspaper reporters from 3 states documenting every word of testimony. Federal prosecutors painted him as a disturbed veteran who'd used mountain superstitions to justify a murder spree, while defense attorneys argued for consideration of his war service and the isolated conditions that had shaped his beliefs. Sheriff Tom Harlan testified for 3 hours, describing the investigation and arrest without mentioning blue fires, impossible footprints, or families who'd vanished into mountain mist. His testimony was factual, clinical, empty of anything that might challenge a federal jury's understanding of how the world worked. Agent Morrison had been reassigned to Chicago. His final report on the Laurel County investigation, classified as containing information that could compromise federal operations in rural districts. The official record described Billy Cobb's crimes as the isolated acts of a mentally unstable individual, motivated by personal grievance and economic desperation. Billy himself said little during the trial, answering questions directly but offering no explanation for his actions beyond protecting his family from what he called obligations that federal law don't understand. He showed no remorse, no recognition that his crimes were anything other than necessary actions taken in extraordinary circumstances. The jury deliberated for 43 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder. Billy received 6 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never leave federal prison alive. But the federal justice system had one more surprise. 3 days before Billy's scheduled transfer to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, he was found dead in his cell. No signs of violence, no indication of suicide, just a man who'd simply stopped breathing during the night. The prison physician noted that Billy's body showed signs of extreme cold exposure, despite the fact that his cell had been heated, and his death occurred during a warm May evening. His face, the physician reported privately, bore the expression of someone who'd seen something wonderful. Sheriff Harlan attended Billy's funeral in Laurel County, watching as the young man was buried beside his uncle Ezekiel in the Cobb family cemetery. Most of the county attended the service, mountain families who understood that Billy had died protecting them from something federal agents would never comprehend. Reverend Combs delivered a eulogy that praised Billy's sacrifice while carefully avoiding any details that might interest federal investigators still operating in the area. The service was simple, dignified, marked by the kind of silence that comes when people share knowledge too dangerous to voice. After the burial, Harlan visited Raccoon Hollow one final time. Ezekiel's still remained where it had been built, the copper kettle cold and empty, no trace of the blue fire that had burned for 2 weeks during October. The hollow felt peaceful now, ordinary, just another fold in the mountains where water ran clear and trees grew thick. But Harlan knew that peace was temporary, purchased with 7 lives and guaranteed for only 29 years. In 1955, the debt would come due again, and someone would have to decide whether to pay it or face the consequences of default. He left flowers beside the spring where Ezekiel had drawn water for his operation, a small tribute to a man who died to settle accounts that predated federal law by over a century. Then he walked back to his truck and drove down the mountain, returning to a world where justice wore badges and carried guns and pretended that human authority meant something in places where older powers held sway. Behind him, Raccoon Hollow dozed in the afternoon sunshine, empty and quiet and waiting. The families who'd fled Laurel County during the October troubles returned slowly, cautiously, over the following months. They found their homes undisturbed but somehow changed, marked by experiences they couldn't describe and wouldn't discuss. Children who'd vanished for days returned with no memory of where they'd been, speaking occasionally of blue lights and voices that called from beneath the earth. Mrs. Eleanor Rash continued her work at the Historical Society, filing away documents and preserving records, maintaining the careful balance between official history and dangerous truth. She never spoke publicly about the contracts or the payments, but she kept the papers safe, understanding that future generations might need to know the price of living in certain places. Agent Hatcher returned to federal service in the Midwest, where bootleggers were human and crimes followed patterns that made sense within established law. He never requested assignment to rural districts again, content to pursue cases where evidence behaved according to scientific principles and suspects didn't possess knowledge that predated the Constitution. Sheriff Harlan served 3 more terms before retiring to a small farm outside Pineville, where he raised tobacco and kept his mouth shut about matters that federal agents couldn't understand. He died in 1953, 2 years before the next payment came due, taking his secrets to a grave marked by a simple sandstone marker. The hollow itself became a place locals avoided without quite understanding why. Hunters claimed their dogs wouldn't track game in that direction. Children developed inexplicable fears about certain paths. Federal agents occasionally investigated reports of illegal distilling in the area, but their equipment malfunctioned, and their investigations led nowhere. Time moved forward as it always does in the mountains, slowly, patiently, marked by seasons and decades and the gradual turnover of human generations. The original families scattered, their bloodlines mixing with newcomers who knew nothing of ancient contracts and old debts. But the mountains remember everything, and certain obligations transcend human understanding of justice or law. And late on October nights, when the moon is dark and the air turns suddenly cold, local people still report strange lights dancing in Raccoon Hollow, blue fires that burn without heat and call to anyone foolish enough to investigate. In these mountains, some debts are never fully paid, only deferred until the next generation discovers what their ancestors borrowed and what they'll be expected to repay. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.